Thank you, Deputy Minister Kekana, for giving us context and also highlighting that although there are challenges in South Africa, there is resilience, there is rebuilding, and there is lots of investment appetite. Also for locating us in the context of our continent and the possibilities from the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. So before we begin discussing any type of recovery, there needs to be an accurate and honest diagnosis of the issues at hand. To this end, I'd like to call to the stage the panelists for the Reflect session. Mr. Ashwell Jenneker is the Deputy Director General at Statistics South Africa, Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana from the University of Johannesburg, Ms. Sithembile Ntombela, who's the Acting CEO of Brand South Africa, Ms. Joanne Bate, who's the COO of the IDC. The panel will be anchored by Mr. Milton Nkosi. He's the Chairman of MMN International Consulting, specializing in reputation, advisory, and media, and former Bureau Chief of the BBC. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Deputy Minister. That was a lovely speech. We are grateful to be here. It's a beautiful day in Johannesburg today. The mood of this session is that we reflect. So we are doing a diagnosis of what the ailment of our economy is. And as you heard, my panelists have been already been introduced. So we will just cut straight to it without much delay. Ashwell, I'll start with you. You are the Deputy Director General of Stats Operational and Provincial Coordination. Please tell us what is the problem as far as you are concerned. What are the stats telling you about where South Africa ought to be, and what we need to overcome the post-COVID recovery, and what stands out for you as the priority where we need to focus on to try and get this economy moving?
Thanks, Milton. Thanks for having us here. I'm representing the Statistician General. Mm-hmm. And you know, statisticians, they speak in tongues. You normally don't understand what they're saying. I'll also have to speak in tongues because otherwise Faisal will report back that I spoke like a normal person today, and we don't want to do that. But before I start speaking in tongues, let me just say there's 60.1 million people in South Africa. So that's the only thing you must remember from what I'm saying. Because it's very cool if you're at a party and you can casually mention that. There's 60.1 million people in South Africa. We calculate that every year. Mid-year, June, July, we take into account the number of people that passed on, number of people that came into South Africa, and the number of people that get born. Now, interesting about our 60.1 million people in South Africa is we're a very young nation. I mean, our median, now median is just another thing for about average. But I have to say median because, you know, I'm a statistician. So our median age is 28. So we're a very young population. There's more than 60% of our people that's below 60. So there's something called a demographic dividend. Now that means you've got young people and you've got the potential. Countries who's got a demographic dividend can grow. Now that's when the people are sort of healthy, they've got good education, and they're employed. Okay, so then you can reach something called a demographic dividend. So our potential in South Africa to reach that is high. So let's try to remember that, besides the 60.1. So what's the problems that we've got? I mean, for one, we've got very high poverty and inequality. And I mean, it's been perennial. I mean, it's not just started now, since the start of our National Development Plan, our poverty and inequality was high. 4 out of 10 people are living below the poverty line. So that's the lower bound poverty line. We're tracking in South Africa the lower bound poverty line. And that, in today's prices, that's 890 rand. So 4 out of 10 people are living below 890 rand a month. That's a huge problem for us. Why is that? I mean, what are the main drivers of poverty? There are 2 things. There's a lot of things that drives poverty, but let's just talk about the main 2 things, because Milton is trying to put me in a bit of a box. So the first thing is unemployment. So unemployment is the major driver of poverty, and then second is education. So we need to create jobs, and then we need to educate our people. So we find that we are currently sitting at 34.4% of our people officially unemployed, and 44.4% of the people being unemployed when you look at the expanded definition. Now that just means people are tired of going to look. They're discouraged. They don't go and look for work. So that's 44.4% of people unemployed. Now, let's get back to our demographic dividend. Because now remember, you've got lots of young people. Because we're a young nation. So, for us to get the demographic dividend, you must create employment. You must educate the people in South Africa. What's happening in South Africa, there's something that we call NEET. I don't want to speak in tongues, but I must tell you about NEET. So NEET means not in employment, not in education, not in training. So NEET. Now you can imagine if you're not in employment, not in education, not in training, you're doing absolutely nothing. So in South Africa, we've got 3.4 million people between the ages of 15 to 24 that's in this category called NEET. 3.4 million between 15 and 24. They do absolutely nothing. Every day they wake up and they do nothing. In the age groups 15 to 34, there's 9.1 million people that's in the category called NEET. Now remember I spoke about demographic dividend. Now the opposite of that, when you don't reach your demographic dividend, then you've got something called a demographic bomb. And in KZN and in parts of Gauteng, we saw some of that erupting. Now there were a few hundred and maybe 1,000 people that were breaking things down and rioting. But remember, there's 9.1 million people that's doing nothing. So this demographic dividend that we could potentially reach will be a demographic bomb, and we might see a lot more in South Africa than what we saw in KwaZulu-Natal.
Can I just come in there,
Yeah.
Ashwell? Would you say the problem in South Africa is that our population is too big for our GDP? 60 million is quite a lot of people.
Okay, no, there's not a lot of people here, and the problem is not the people at all. But in many ways, the problem is our growth rate. I mean, for us to create jobs or to have a growth rate that creates jobs, we need to grow between about 4 and 5% per year. What we have found is last year, 2020, okay, that was a COVID year, so it's not a normal year, but we grew with minus 6.4%. We've now recovered a little bit in this quarter, where we're now growing at 1.2%. That is back to where we were in 2017. So for us to create jobs, and I mean that's our first priority. We need to create jobs. We need to grow with about 4 to 5%. We're currently growing at 1.2%. So Milton, we're not growing at the levels where we can create sustainable jobs. So what you find in South Africa, what we've got is, we give people grants. In rural areas, about 51% of the people are living from grants and remittances. Households, we've got 45% of households living from grants. Now that keeps people out of poverty, but definitely not what creates prosperity and what we want for our country.
That's incredible. Can I bring in your neighbor, Professor Mcebisi join us? It's good to see you in your flesh and not on TV pontificating. Mcebisi?
I'm the Ndletyana, not the Jonas.
Okay, okay. I was trying to wind you up there. Believe it or not. So you spend a lot of the time studying our political landscape as it plays itself out in the nation's theater of dreams. What's your honest assessment about the impact of the COVID pandemic, corruption, and the recent civil unrest that we heard about, and racial tensions, and, can I add, because you've got a big brain, xenophobia?
Well, that's quite an open-ended question. I think these are all episodes of a much bigger problem. Perhaps one should go to the essence of the problem instead of the details. I think fundamentally we need to reset. The manner of our liberation led us into a path where we prioritized instant gratification, instant delivery of the fruits of freedom, instead of investing in the sustainability of the country. For instance, if you look at local communities, initially, we needed to build townships, we needed to build all that. And some of these communities obviously did not have sufficient revenue. So they received grants from national government. But those grants were geared towards building new infrastructure instead of maintaining the old infrastructure. So part of prioritizing the new infrastructure was to demonstrate better life for all. But to sustain the old infrastructure that had been there, we needed to generate revenue. People needed to start paying for rates and services. And so there was a campaign, 94, 95, Masakane campaign. But to get people to pay, because they had not been paying for so many years, to get them to pay, we needed to confront them, we needed to make unpopular choices. And these are people who had been accustomed to not pay. So we needed to confront them, and there was a bit of confrontation, and the politicians withdrew because they got fearful that they would not be elected. So what then happened was that over the years, locally generated revenue dwindled further and further. With that dwindling, the infrastructure deteriorated further and further. So our society then, the leadership and development of our society has been pretty much been led by politics, sensitivities, and political priorities over the building of the mechanics of government, the institution, making unpopular choices that might not deliver instant results, but invest in the long term. So we are reaping that now. Most communities' infrastructure is dead. And we talk about development, you know, we like peacocks, you know, peacocks, the prowls around showing their colors, but no one remembers that, in fact, this peacock, which is a bird, can't actually fly. So we're bragging, but there's no substance. We make very big speeches, forgetting that economic development happens in the communities, in the little geographic spaces. So if you don't have a municipality that is functional, people who can fix things, nothing will happen. So that's where we need to get to. So when COVID happens, Milton, COVID is already, we are already in the mess. And so now, you know, trying to rationalize, we're blaming COVID. But there is a fundamental problem in how we think. Our society is driven too much by politics. We distrusted bureaucracy and rules from the beginning because we inherited the bureaucracy and the rules from the apartheid state. And so we tended to defer too much to politicians because they were noble guys, they were heroes. But these heroes soon turned into villains. And very soon, when we tried to introduce legislation, for instance, PMFA and this and that, around 2004, 2005, these heroes had become so used to building nests for themselves. Corruption starts 94, 95, around that time, because the institutions were weak. We're rebuilding these institutions. But by the time we then create new infrastructure, new rules, 2004, 2005, the politicians have become too accustomed to the wages of being in power. They try to get around that, and then national politics gets overtaken by populism. So just as we are beginning to rebuild in 2004, 2005, populism becomes fashionable and vogue. So to be smart is frowned upon. Then the rest, you know, I don't have to repeat that. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ndletyana, for that insightful assessment. I'll come back to you about xenophobia and the looting spree that we saw, otherwise mentioned in my question as civil unrest. We are now coming to Joanne Bate. You are the COO of IDC. What is your thinking about what needs to be done? I mean, you run quite a pretty serious operation funding big industrial projects. What do you think is the area where we need to focus to get this ERRP, the Economic Recovery and Reconstruction Plan, off the ground?
So I'm going to pick up on the maintenance challenges of the past, because we're seeing that in our energy challenges. So it's difficult to build a sustainable economy when we have constant electricity interruptions. Private sector, particularly the larger companies, are able to look at solar solutions, which help them with both greening as well as a stable supply of electricity. But the small manufacturing companies don't have the capital to actually invest in those solar solutions. They don't have the capital to invest in the backup that they need. So when there's electricity interruptions, they don't operate. And a day lost in manufacturing is a day never recovered. So I think one of the greatest challenges we have for small and medium-sized manufacturing companies is this interrupted electricity supply in the country. Water sustainability is another key challenge. We saw day zero approaching fast and furious in Cape Town, but actually that was because Cape Town is so high profile. The stories elsewhere across the country that aren't as sexy as the Cape Town story, we don't hear. So water is a fundamental issue for building businesses that are able to operate effectively. Building agriculture. We've got vast arable land. We don't always have the right water in the right places. So we need to look at how we can ensure that we have the right irrigation schemes in place, the right water infrastructure in place, so we can support the development of agriculture. The focus on the last number of years when we think about jobs is those big infrastructure opportunities, it's the big industrial concerns. The reality is jobs are created in small and medium-sized enterprises. And we don't have an enabling environment for small and medium enterprises. It's difficult to get businesses started. For the informal economy, which we've seen grow significantly over the last number of years, the informal economy, because it's informal, and it chooses to stay informal because it's so difficult and complex and costly to formalize, means that when there is an unrest event and the businesses are impacted, the ability for them to restore livelihoods is extremely difficult, if not impossible. So we really do need to create an enabling environment for small businesses and informal businesses to actually build and thrive. We have a very focused approach within the IDC, so we're no longer just focused on large industrial opportunities. We're thinking holistically about industrial development. So when we're investing in a large industrial concern, How do we understand the supply chain and distribution chain needs of the company so we can ensure that the small businesses that can supply into the corporate and distribute from the corporate are actually enabled and supported in partnership with those corporates? One of the other challenges I think we have in South Africa is that we've been very good at doing things alone, but very bad at doing things as a collective. So there's been high levels of distrust between public and private sector over the last number of years. And if we think about public or private sector companies going and positioning themselves in the global market, we tend to do it alone. And what I found quite heartening over the last couple of months with the hydrogen economy, which is building up momentum, is the acceptance that this is South Africa's to win, and that we can only succeed in the hydrogen economy if we do it together. So I think that in order to, so I'm going to take a question further, what do we need to do to improve our situation as a country? We need to work together. We need to find that Ubuntu spirit of working together, collaborating, and really ensuring that as labour, public and private sector, we find the solutions that allow us to grow and prosper. One of the key headwinds facing us is the strong carbon nature of our economy. There's talk globally of carbon border taxes. So what does that mean for our manufacturing sector? Well, it means that we can leapfrog and really differentiate going forward. So all of the headwinds we're currently faced with, to me, present an amazing platform and opportunity for building back better and really delivering a high growth economy into the future. But we need to do it together. We need to see the right policy reform. We need to see the right partnership between public and private sector. And we need to move with speed. I think the other challenge over the last number of years, it's been slow to progress any levels of licensing, permits, to try and get electricity connections for businesses. So we've we have built factories and funded the building of factories, and then it takes time for electricity to be connected. Those matters should be seamless.
Thank you so much, Joanne. That was quite comprehensive. I think you are hearing there are opportunities for growth in the economy. Let me bring in the boss in the house. This is Ms. Sithembile Ntombela, who's the acting CEO of Brand South Africa. My question for you, you are the de facto CEO of Brand South Africa, and hope that you actually get on to do the proper job without the acting part of it. So wishing you all the best in that. You have the benefit of observing the nation's image at home and abroad from a vantage point. What's the role of an organization such as Brand South Africa as we reimagine the future?
Thank you. Quite an interesting question and very important as well. And I suppose in giving you my response, I'll start from a global outlook and then zone in at home. You know, entities like Brand South Africa, globally, they exist because nation branding is a game of branding. So when one understands the building blocks of a brand, one is actually then, or cannot rather, stay away from understanding the intricacies that are involved in building a sustainable and a competitive brand. So they exist to build an image of the country. So I'll ask a simple question. We grew up, or I won't divulge my age, but I grew up in an era where it was really hot to date a guy dating Italian shoes. Don't ask me why. But that's a perception that was created by Italy. And it was created because there's a strong association of quality belts and, and shoes with Italy. Similarly with France, similarly with Brazil and Samba. I can name many countries where the associations play a crucial role in you triggering, an interest to visit. So to answer your point, these destination organizations or marketing agencies, they precisely exist to make sure that the countries remain top of mind amongst investors, amongst tourists, but also they build reputation and image. That is quite compelling and will almost enable and ignite that interest to people to come and say, I would like to go and visit South Africa. What is it about South Africa? So, in a nutshell, I'm talking about, the share of visibility, the share of voice. That is the game that we are fighting for. The market share, in the branded environment, where we see brands, we say today, Abokomo is fighting a Kellogg's brand. Because they understand their strategies, they understand their weakest point, they understand their unique selling propositions. So that's from a global and just taking from a brand understanding that entities such as Brand South Africa exist precisely to do that. Once we understand that we are building a brand, and that brand called South Africa, then we cannot take away the responsibility, the accountability, as well as the measuring effect that needs to come into play. When we say to the world, we are a South Africa that inspires new ways, are we then delivering on our promise? So our job as an entity that is like Brand South Africa, or that is Brand South Africa, is precisely that, to make sure that South Africa is at the tip of the tongue from investors' mind. When they think of investing in the African continent, South Africa must come as a priority country, because we are a strategic partner to the rest of the continent. So these entities, they are not a nice to have, because there's this perception that, marketing agencies, marketing is frivolous, they think it's not hard sell, but it is very strategic, because I will not come and visit you, if I don't know anything about you, nor will I marry you if you don't tell me your proposition. So these entities exist to articulate the value proposition of countries.
But as an ordinary person from Orlando West who supports Orlando Pirates,
that's a good one, actually.
friends are few when
days are dark.
Days are dark when,
Can I also piggyback into that after she's answered?
Yes, yes. What's the difference, as an ordinary person, what's the difference between Brand South Africa and South African tourism, for instance?
Oh, well, it's quite simple. South African tourism is sector-specific. The ripple effect, though, they do benefit the overall country. But the minute you say it's a sector, it's because it's tourism. Brand South Africa is essentially promoting the country in its entirety. So it means everything about South Africa that is worth telling a story. That is the responsibility of Brand South Africa. So we tell that good story, we tell the proposition of the country to the world, essentially. So it's from the people in Orlando supporting Orlando Pirates. It is telling about, showcasing Pitso. Who knew that Pitso, our very own, can go and lead a team, in Egypt. So for us, it's really telling of those stories. So no matter who you are, layman on the street, let's promote South Africa. We are not selling it, because if we sell it, then what will we have? But we are promoting South Africa to the world, and we are using our people to tell that story. We are using our competitive advantages. We are using our inspiration to then say, this is who we are, and these are the reasons to believe. So in a country where entities like this don't exist, those countries are doomed, because there's no association. So how do you associate, a particular country? Even Japan, back in the days, I'm talking about 15 years ago, we didn't know what Japan was all about. Suddenly we know, okay, there's kimonos, okay, there's the car industry in Japan, and that is why you saw the overwhelming feedback at the World Cup rugby. Because suddenly they say, oh, South Africa, Madiba, South Africa, oh, Bafana, South Africa, this and that. Those are the small building blocks. And what is important for us is to tell the story that says, wherever you are and whatever actions you do, they have a consequence to the nation brand. And that is why then we exist, to manage those reputation gaps.
No, that is destination branding. What she's talking about is called destination branding. And it's important in how we for the name changing process and tourism. Name changes has a lot of objectives that it tries to achieve. One is linguistic and heritage restoration, and the other is tourism and commerce. What we have tended to do, and I want to mention the specific example of what should have been the Nelson Mandela City instead of Gqeberha, clumsily called Gqeberha. Back in 2010, just before the World Cup, the municipality decided that they would not market Port Elizabeth internationally because the name was not really in keeping with the new South Africa. So they took a resolution and named the city Nelson Mandela City. More like, New York State, New York City. So it's Nelson Mandela Metro. It can also be Nelson Mandela City. They took that decision, invested a lot of money, marketing the city internationally as part of promoting the World Cup because PE was going to be one of the host cities. However, they couldn't officialize the name because they had to prioritize World Cup activities. And so this time around, when the name change issue came up, and I was one of those who was part of the process of writing up the report, by the way, reminding all the participants of the decision that had been taken back in 2009, 2010. They simply discarded that. They opted for a name, Gqeberha, because that affirmed the linguistic and heritage. However, the question always be, what objective do you advance where? What are you likely to reap out of this? And my view was that, and many of us, was that the Nelson Mandela City is a brand into which the municipality has already invested a lot of money. And upon hearing it, it invokes, it endears the city to a number of people because the name is an international brand. However, the affirmation, this essentialism, partly because most of those who objected to the name change were white folks. So they were spiting white people because these white people are objecting to the name because they can't object. So we cannot do things to spite white folks or to spite whoever. We have to do things that are best for our own country.
Joanne, are you listening?
So this is very important. We haven't been thinking about it. And this is the thing about politics driving everything, without common sense. There's a lot of common sense that is required in our decision making.
Thank you so much for that input. I want to bring in two questions. Remember, we've got this audience here with us, but it's a hybrid event, so we have others following us online. And when you're online, you're already on your fingertips asking questions. So we have a question from Nkosi Sifiso Nobela, who's asking, how do we improve the level of growth to improve the rate, and what infrastructure is in place to help solve problems? I think, who wants to take that? I think that's yours, Joanne. Infrastructure.
What infrastructure is in place?
And then, sorry, let me just fire the last one because we only have 5 minutes to go, sadly. We've got Pamela Manuko Mashiane. Prof, what is going to take for SA to consider rural economy as one of avenues to grow? You mentioned rural economy as the economy well. And what is the appetite for that politically?
I will take a stab at both questions. So from an infrastructure perspective, we have, there's solid, my microphone is still working. We have solid infrastructure in place. I've mentioned the challenges around water, wastewater, and electricity. There was the talk of the big infrastructure programs that we're planning to take place, and a large-scale infrastructure project remains necessary to restore confidence that we as a country are committed in driving things forward. However, I don't think that the growth agenda is dependent on large-scale infrastructure development. I think there's significant growth potential within the small and medium space for companies to grow. If you look at the global disruptions that have happened in supply chains, that's both a risk to us as well as a tremendous advantage. The risk is that we are often forced to hold significantly longer stock days because of global supply chain disruptions, but that increases the opportunity for localization. So I think we need to be, and this talks into the rural side, we need to be far more focused in our development objectives and plans, and we need to act with speed in delivering on them. So when we think about the Northern Cape, so the Northern Cape we've been looking at quite actively because of the significant mining presence, the significant underdevelopment outside of the mines, and the significant development in the solar and wind space. So how do we think about the Northern Cape differently in the context of mining land that could be available for agriculture? How do we then develop that agriculture, support small farmers in building a rural hub within the Northern Cape, and focusing on the supply chains in the region that can actually drive localization within the region?
Let's leave it for Professor Ndletyana to close it with the political will. Is there political will?
There is recognition of the seriousness and the urgency to do something, but there's lack of courage to do what is necessary, because to do what is necessary is to risk electoral support. The leadership in this country takes a lot of trips to China. One would have hoped that they would have learned a lot of things from China. Of course, China is not a democracy, it's a dictatorship. But what they tell us is to prioritize. You have to sit behind the desk and do the things that are necessary. You can't just elect anybody. I mean, the leadership, interestingly, a long time ago, 1997, decided that for government leadership, you needed people with expertise, with skills. And this popularity thing, they even said, doesn't work everywhere. You need people with skills as far back as 97. Had they heeded that advice, a lot of things would have been done, appointing proper people into. So there's a lot of talk. I don't know if they will ever do it. There's a lot of talk. A manifesto was launched just yesterday. It's talk. There's been that talk for a number of years. Whether or not they actually get around to doing it, I don't know. But the point is that we need to risk, politicians need to risk even losing political support by doing the unpopular things. You can't retain parastatals that are not functioning.
Well, just there, thank you so much. We are so grateful for your insights. I'm terribly sorry that we have to end it here. I know the discussion will continue online, and thank you very much for being a wonderful audience with no applause for any of the major sound bites that were mentioned here. But Ashwell, thank you so much. I will brag. I will brag about the population of South Africa from you, Professor Ndletyana. Always good to see you. Fascinating insights. Joanne, thank you so much. And Sithembile, thank you so very much, and good luck with everything that you do at Brand SA. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. This is your Reflect panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.